Good evening, and welcome to What's Your Story? My guest today is Katherine Glore, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Annie Oakley, Lucy Ware Webb Hayes, wife of President Rutherford B. Hayes, Florence Harding, wife of President Warren Harding, Toni Morrison, Maya Lin, who designed the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., and Halle Berry are all connected to or were originally from the state of Ohio. Mrs. Glore also hails from the Buckeye State. It gets that name because of the prevalence of all the Buckeye trees found there. Her story is the journey of a little girl from Hicksville, Ohio, who is now the executive director of one of the most prominent women's organizations in Connecticut, the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. Welcome to the show, Katherine.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know you told me to call you Kat, so I'll do that.
Thank you.
All right. June 16th, 2016, you became executive director of the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. Take us on the journey that brought you from Hicksville, Ohio to that position.
You know, it's been quite the journey. I, as you referenced, was born and grew up in a tiny little town in Ohio called Hicksville. And it is just as rural as that name may lead you to believe.
No pun intended.
No pun intended. Actually named after the same gentleman that Hicksville, Long Island is named after.
Okay.
So there is that connection.
All right.
After I graduated with a French degree, knew I didn't want to teach. I figured I needed to find some sort of employment. And I was lucky in that my college hired me right before I graduated into their development department. So I started my career by calling up alumni and asking them for money, which wasn't nearly as bad as you're probably thinking right now. I was able to share stories about what was happening on campus then and hear stories about what people experienced when they had been students. And I realized that story matters.
That's the name of the show.
Exactly.
Yes.
You know, it matters in bringing people together. It matters in raising money. And I got my career in philanthropy started that way. Was lucky enough to move to Connecticut now, goodness, over 15 years ago, and have worked for primarily educational or cultural institutions.
So you're in Hicksville. How did you get to Connecticut?
So I'm in Hicksville, and I knew that I wanted something a little bigger than Hicksville, but I wasn't quite sure what that was. And the biggest thing I could think of at the time would be to leave the country. So when I was 18 years old, I got on a plane for the first time, and I flew to France, where I was going to be an exchange student through the Rotary International program. And I realized then, for the first time, really just how big the world was, and also what it meant to be other. You know, what it meant to not be a local, to not speak the language, to essentially to have your story removed from you.
Cultural shock.
Exactly.
Yes,
you know, and
yes.
I looked like it, you know, pretty much everybody in my town, but all I had to do was open my mouth for a second, and I realized that I was not from there.
Yep.
And that too, like, helped me understand the importance of bridging that gap of other, and that what we perceive as someone who maybe doesn't have a lot of similarities, in fact, is much more like us than we realize. And so that's become a big part of my career and my, I guess, mission as a human, as well as in bridging those gaps.
How did you find French culture? Did you like it, or?
Oh, I loved it.
Yeah.
I mean, I was living in Normandy, so the food there was not bad at all. And you know, it's a slower pace of life. Even coming from a place like Hicksville,
it's slower than Hicksville.
It was
Wow.
slower than Hicksville. You know, people take the time to sit and eat meals together.
Yes.
I would go home every day for lunch with my host family rather than eating in the school cafeteria. We would have, you know, an hour and a half to get together and commune, you know, to break bread together.
Wow.
And I loved that.
You wanted to be a doctor. What changed your mind?
I did. You know, I did okay in school as a kid, and so that's kind of what you envision as doctor or lawyer, you know, set your goals high. And I even worked in a hospital for many years after school or during summers. But it was that first year living in France where, and I remember it so vividly, a new theater had just opened in town. And I was sitting there in the audience, and I didn't understand anything that was happening. I didn't speak any French at the time.
Yes.
But I was sitting there and I was crying. And I think it was a comedy on stage. I mean, I was not reacting to what was on stage at all. I was reacting to how much I missed that part of my life. Music and theater was very important to me growing up. And sitting there and realizing that that piece of me is what I missed the most. It wasn't my work in the hospital. It was being a part of a creative community. So I said, you know what, maybe I need to rethink my future career plans.
Right. You know, there's a story you tell, maybe I didn't get it right, so help me here. Did you have Amish babysitters, or did you babysit for the Amish? Would you explain about the changing of the clothes and why and all that?
Yes, so again, Hicksville is a very rural community with a very large Amish population. And so growing up, I and my two younger sisters had babysitters that were Amish. And we would go to their house every day, and depending on what was going on, may change out of our English clothes. So if you're not Amish or Mennonite, then you're essentially English in the community.
All right.
And so, you know, the girls would wear very plain single color dresses and have caps on their head, and we would love wearing those clothes as well. And, you know, learning to, well, I'd like to say that I learned to drive a horse and buggy. Really, they flattered me by allowing me to hold the reins as a kid. But it's something that I didn't realize was special at all until I left. I didn't realize that I was getting this incredible cultural education as well. Actually, again, until I went to France, and people would compare it to the movie Witness.
Yes, of course.
And I realized that, not everybody gets to do this. You know, how lucky am I?
Is there still a large Amish population there in Hicksville?
There is, absolutely. Now, something that I realized, many of the children, the Amish children that were friends of mine growing up, are no longer part of the religion. You know, we live in a world where technology is changing things more and more every day, and I think even those who live theoretically without electricity, without access to television. There wasn't an internet when I was a child, but it's harder to keep that simple way of life.
As executive director of the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame, please tell our viewing audience, what are some of your many, many duties?
I've got the best job in the world. Like, essentially, my job is to celebrate women and their accomplishments all day, every day. Now, what that means on a day-to-day basis, you always see, I think, on job advertisements and other duties as assigned. So it can be everything from, right now I'm working on films, tribute films for our inductees this year. So speaking with the producer, trying to schedule locations and interviews with people. I get to do an enormous amount of public speaking. So first of all, learning the stories of all of the women in the hall. There are 115 right now. But also developing new ways of bringing those stories together. You know, not just talking about history in general, but let's talk about Connecticut's African-American heroines, or let's talk about Jewish women from Connecticut, or let's talk about the lessons we can learn from these women about cultivating confidence, about pushing past no, about what it takes to really make a difference in the world.
So your basic function is to celebrate the accomplishments of women. Is that fair?
It is, and then doing that through writing newsletter articles. There's, of course, in a position like mine, a lot of fundraising. We're a nonprofit, so we rely 100% right now on philanthropy to provide all of the services that we do.
So let's say there was no Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame at all. What would be lost?
Oh, goodness. Well, I think, you know, if you go back to our founding, you can see already what didn't exist. So back in 1993, Gina Clonan, who was at the time managing director of the Connecticut Forum up in Hartford, they were working on a forum and focused on women's accomplishments, and realized that they wanted to bring it back a little more local. You know, there are, of course, you know, some of the women that we know, Harriet Beecher Stowe, you know, Helen Keller, who we don't necessarily equate with Connecticut, but who lived here for 30 years. But there are so many other women whose names aren't known and who have done amazing things here in the state. And so Gina and a group of volunteers looked around to see, well, what organizations are really bringing forth Connecticut women? And they didn't find one. And so what happened was she actually reached out to the National Women's Hall of Fame in Seneca Falls and asked, you know, well, are there other states' halls of fame? Is this something that we could do? Originally, they were told that Connecticut would actually be the 26th Hall of Fame. It turns out that there was a mistake in their research. We were only the 6th at the time. But what you lose in not having that, and what we've gained since then, is that local connection. Again, we all learn the story of Helen Keller growing up. But when you hear, oh, but she was in Easton. If you're a child in Easton, whether you're a little girl, a little boy, particularly if
there's
you're someone,
connection,
there's that immediate connection that makes you think, oh, well, maybe I'm like this person.
Absolutely.
Or maybe this person is like me. And that's so important.
When did your parents learn that you were a thespian?
So my mom likes to say that I started performing as a toddler, singing off-key loudly in church.
That's right. There we go.
But no, as I had referenced, having a creative outlet was such an important part of my life, and you see it in many others. I first auditioned for a community theater show when I was 5. We had gone to see My Fair Lady, and the mother of a friend of mine was in it, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world.
Yes.
And so when that same friend told me that The Sound of Music was coming up and she was going to audition, I convinced my mother that I needed to as well, and was lucky to be cast in the role, which started really growing up all the way up through college. The importance of being involved in the theater community helped me grow and dream and imagine bigger things, which, is so important in the work that I do today, too.
Wow. That sounds really interesting, to all of a sudden, like you were telling the story of sitting there crying because you realized you missed that part of your development. That sounds so similar to probably dozens of people in our listening audience today who made those types of discoveries about themselves and made that connection with you. Amelia Bingham, right? That name rings a bell with you. What role did she play in your life?
So Amelia kind of brings all of this together, too. Again, growing up in Hicksville, or in a small town anywhere, it's, I think, difficult sometimes to imagine what a life in the larger world might look like. So I was just beginning high school, starting to try to figure out what it was I wanted to be.
Yes.
In 1993, when Amelia Bingham was herself inducted into the Ohio Women's Hall of Fame. Now, Amelia was from Hicksville, grew up in the town. She her family ran the local hotel there, and so theater artists would come through and would often stay there. And she met an actor who she ended up marrying, and through that started her own theater career. So Amelia Bingham ended up being essentially the first successful manager/producer on Broadway who was also a woman. And for me, seeing not only this person from my hometown, but this person succeeded in an area where, even though I didn't think I would necessarily find a career in the theater, in something that I loved, and this was, back in the 1890s, was such an inspiration.
That's extraordinary.
Absolutely, to see a woman that long ago, spreading her wings wide and achieving something that no other woman had up until that point was really inspirational.
Wow. Kat, has your organization been a victim of its own success? An example would be when President Obama was elected, many people said that there is no need for civil rights anymore because we have an African-American president. Has your success been partly responsible for, say, recruiting issues that you might have experienced? Have you worked your way out of a job, so to speak?
I think, unfortunately, it's going to be a long time before organizations like ours are needed.
Before that happens, yeah.
The same thing when President Obama was elected, you would hear people say, well, it's a post-racial society now, proof that race is no longer something that encumbers people who are looking for success. And then we have just to look around us and see that's not exactly the case. The same thing with women. And if we stay in politics, this last election, we have set a new record for the number of women in Congress. We are now at 19.4% of representation, which is something that deserves to be celebrated.
Yes, it does.
But just to put it in context, Saudi Arabia, where women got the right to vote in 2015, have a mandated 20% representation. So Saudi Arabia has more women in their parliament than we have in our Congress. Look from politics to business. And let's just look at the Fortune 500 list, the 500 largest publicly traded companies.
Yes.
That list started in 1955. It wasn't until the early 70s that a woman was first running a company on that list. Now in 2010, when our inductee, Anne Mulcahy, became the head of Xerox, she was one of 6 women. So already a little more progression.
Wow.
But there are still, even today, less than 5% of Fortune 500 companies who are run by women. Yes, women are making progress. We're making strides. We are now, enjoying more privilege and power than we've had in the past. But there's still a long way to go.
Would it make it a better company because a woman runs it? What does a woman bring?
Well, you know what? I would make the same argument that I would make for having more people of color.
Okay.
When you have diversity on your board,
Yep.
on your staff, in your community, you have not just people of different colors or people of different genders, but you have diversity of opinion and of thought. And that makes us stronger. It's important to have people who challenge power and authority, because otherwise things never change. And it's important, I think, for organizations like ours, all organizations, to reflect the communities that they serve as well.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. As you said, Gina Cloland, founder, I gave her that in 1993.
Yes.
The mission of the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame is to honor, educate, preserve, and inspire. And this year's theme is Heroic Women. Is that correct?
It is.
Okay.
So we referenced during our very first induction ceremony, now almost 24 years ago, we inducted 46 women. We were making up for lost time there.
Yes.
But in recent years, we've been inducting 3 women into the hall along a particular theme. And this year, the theme is Heroic Women, honoring those who protect and serve. So we have 3 inductees this year who have made their careers in uniform. Captain Kristen Greist, who just recently was one of the first 2 women to graduate from Army Ranger School.
Oh, yes. I think I saw the video of her. Yes.
Very impressive. She
Yes.
later became our country's first female Army infantry officer and was very recently promoted to commander. So breaking barriers still today. We're also inducting Regina Rush Kittle. Major Regina Rush Kittle, who, in addition to having served in the Middle East as part of the Army Marine Reserves, also had a 30-year career in the state police, breaking both gender and racial barriers all the way up.
Yes.
And then a historic induction of Colonel Ruth Lucas, who, at the time that she left the Air Force, was the highest-ranking woman of color ever, and she was the very first African-American female colonel in the Air Force.
My goodness. Heroic women.
Heroic women. But we also, there are heroic women around us every day.
Every day.
Not just this 3. So what we also do at the induction ceremony, in addition to the inductees, is we select another 10 women who, while they're not being inducted this year, are doing work along that theme that's very important. So we will be recognizing firefighter, police, women in the law, a woman who really shaped, constructed the EMT service in one of our communities. So it's an exciting way for us to talk about women who today even are continuing to do important things.
The thought occurs to me that perhaps someday we'll get to the point where we'll stop saying the founding fathers and start saying the founding parents. What do you think?
Exactly. Actually, one of our school programs is entitled Remember the Ladies.
Okay.
So specifically, looking at the women who founded this country.
Sure, absolutely.
One of the things that we try to make sure that particularly young girls understand too is that history is not just names and dates of dead white men in dusty history books.
That's right.
History's being made around us every day.
Every day. I think we should explain to the listening audience that the museum is a virtual museum. And would you explain what that means to our viewing audience? Why isn't it bricks and mortar?
Exactly. That's one of the first questions I usually get is, well, when can I come visit the hall? And the answer is, in this case, is any time. So you don't have to get dressed, get in the car, drive to a place, pay admission, hope that your children are going to behave for the maybe 90 minutes you can keep them in a museum.
Yes.
Instead, if it's 2 in the morning, you can't sleep, and you're wondering which of Connecticut's women were active in the suffrage movement, you can go to our museum online. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have exhibits. We do. We have 2 that travel right now. A beautiful black and white portrait exhibit of our inductees that's really most appropriate for adult audiences. But we also have a multi-themed panel exhibit called We Fight for Roses Too that looks at the larger historic context of women's rights. So those travel to libraries, to schools, to different community organizations. And then we bring the hall on the road as well with public presentations. In addition to all of the school programs that we do in classrooms and an incredible curricula that we call DIY History that's available free of charge for educators to download from our website.
So if I went on your website, I could take a virtual tour of the museum, look at the inductees, and look at what you're doing to celebrate, what, your 23rd? Your 23rd
it's the 24th
year?
coming up, yeah.
What are you guys doing for that, as a matter of fact?
So that is, as I said, primarily we're celebrating the history of and accomplishments of women in uniform this year.
Oh, that's right, the heroic women.
It is.
Okay.
So we have the induction ceremony this year is November 9th, and it is...
It's my daughter's birthday.
Is it really? Well, happy birthday to her. She should join us.
Yes.
There's nothing more empowering.
Got to give a shout out to Thumper.
Well, Thumper should be in a room with almost 1,000 other people celebrating women this year at the convention center.
Absolutely. You know, you have some past inductees here that were amazing to me that I would never have thought about and never knew about. Like, well, Marian Anderson, most people have heard of her. Judy Cohen, first woman rabbi in Connecticut to have extended tenure of her own congregation. Katharine Hepburn, one of the most accomplished actresses. Beatrice Fox Auerbach, president of G. Fox and Company, business leader and philanthropist. Betty Tianti, the nation's first woman president of the state AFL-CIO. Helen Keller, who we talked about earlier. You get Maria Sanchez, first Hispanic woman elected to the Connecticut legislature in 1994. Ella Tambusi-Grasso, first woman in the nation to be elected governor in her own right. I love this name, Gladys Tantacquidgen. I love saying that. She was an anthropologist and Mohegan medicine woman. Prudence Crandall with a direct connection to slavery and the abolitionists. And Theodate Pope Riddle. I love that one too. Noted female architect who designed the Hillstead Museum and the Avon Old Farms and Westover Schools in 1994. So who are some of the most recent inductees? Give us a couple of names.
Okay, so more recently, just last year, where our theme was women's wellness, we inducted Rebecca Lobo.
Oh, really? Okay.
Who, of course, we know is an incredible athlete, really the start of the Connecticut Huskies,
Dynasty.
Thank you.
Yes, there you go.
So we inducted Rebecca Lobo last year, who, of course, is an incredible athlete, really the start of the Connecticut Huskies dynasty. But also with her mother, who was a breast cancer patient, also worked on increasing awareness of breast cancer research and funded a scholarship at the school specifically for women and minorities in the allied health fields.
Goodness. Her mother's a breast cancer survivor.
No, her mother had breast cancer before she passed.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yes.
So she was, all right, okay. You never know the story. See, that's
exactly,
why.
Exactly, it's the story, like Jane Pauley, who was also inducted last year.
Jane Pauley, I know, broadcaster.
Exactly, we know her as a broadcaster, but she has also been very open about living with bipolar disorder.
Okay.
And when someone with, I hesitate to call her a celebrity, but when somebody with that much influence speaks open and honestly about mental health.
Makes it real.
It changes it for everybody.
Makes it real, yeah. Quickly, what message would you leave for the young girls watching today?
Oh, it's a message that I hope that women everywhere wake up with as well, is I want every girl in the state of Connecticut to wake up saying, you know what, I can do this.
I can do this.
Whatever her personal this is.
I can do it.
And if she isn't the first, I want her to know the name of the first woman who did that.
All right. That's all the time we have for tonight's show. My thanks to my guest, Katharine Glore, for sharing her story. Thank you for tuning in. Our stories are as different as each snowflake and are as beautiful and numerous as the stars. Everybody has a story. What's yours? Until next time, good night.